Meine Damen und Herren, darf ich beginnen schon? Herzlich willkommen bei unserem nächsten und letzten Sitzung. Wir haben vor uns 4 Referate und die erste Referentin, ich heiße willkommen, ist Frau Iliana Kandzha und sie wird sprechen auf Englisch. Gisela of Hungary as an agent of Christianization in selected historiographic and hagiographic traditions. Sie studierte, soviel ich weiß, in Moskau, an der CU, also Central European University in Budapest, und dort ist nun ihr Doktorvater Daniel Ziemann, den wir gestern gehört haben. Und Frau Kandzha beschäftigt sich vor allem mit königlicher Buße, mit der Figur des heiligen Kaiserpaar Heinrich II. Und seiner Ehefrau heiligen Kunigunde. Also ich und wir alle sind sehr gespannt auf Ihr Vortrag. So now I invite you to speak. It's your floor. Welcome.
Thank you very much for this nice introduction, and hello to everyone, and also we'll use a chance to say thank you and congratulations to the organizers of this conference. I'll now try to share my screen. Yes, here we go. Yeah, hopefully everything works. So I'll talk today about a narrative that has often and quite justifiably been deemed a mistake, a sort of a geographical anecdote. This is the belief that Henry II, German king and emperor from the early 11th century, was responsible for the Christianization of the Hungarian kingdom. According to this tradition, Henry II wed his sister Gisela to Stephen of Hungary, whereupon she converted Stephen and the whole kingdom to Christianity. This German ruler might thus be called the Apostle of the Hungarians, and indeed he is referred as the Apostolus Hungariorum in the hagiographic and liturgical texts devoted to him. And already in the 18th century, Alban Butler, in his famous adaptations, The Lives of the Saints, revealed some of the historical inaccuracies at play. Quote, "It's sometimes mistakenly asserted that he, Saint Henry, wrote about the conversion of Saint Stephen. Yet, although easy to deem historical, such anecdotes are not accidental mistakes. And with this presentation, I'll try to show that these stories are symptomatic of ideas, perceptions, and cultural roles retrospectively assigned to certain historical actors, as well as of the immediate political needs that have spurred these narratives on. This brief prelude on Saint Henry as the Apostle of Hungary brings us closer to the theme of the conference, the role of women in the transition to Christianity, and the protagonist of my talk, Queen Gisela of Hungary, and also sometimes referred to as Gisela of Bavaria. I'll talk about the historiographic construction, according to which Gisela, the spouse of King Stephen and sister of Emperor Henry II, was retrospectively considered a sanctifying wife, or a persuasive wife, to use Martin Holmes's terminology, and who Gisela aided in the conversion of her husband and his people. The union of the Bavarian princess and the Hungarian leader, that is of Gisela and Stephen, is a part of a convoluted process of conversion and peacemaking. But clearly, as has been mentioned in various talks yesterday and today, the process of acquiring Christian identity was much more complicated and contested than it's often portrayed in the Christianization narratives. Here I mainly speak of the conversion as a remembered event. And I will deliberate the question why Gisela's retrospective perception developed and why certain historiographic narratives maintain this, in a sense, historical reputation of her being an agent of Christianization. Not much is known about Queen Gisela as a historical figure, and bits and pieces can be collected from the extant contemporary sources as well as from material culture associated with the Queen's activities and religious donations. She was born around 980 to the Bavarian Duke Henry the Quarrelsome and Gisela of Burgundy, and most probably she was educated in Regensburg together with her sibling Henry, the future Duke and German king. And around 996 or 97, Gisela was wed to Stephen, who was already Christian at that point, and there is now no consensus about the year or the place where the wedding festivities took place, and the possible localities are Regensburg or Cheyenne or Esztergom. In her role as the first Hungarian queen, Gisela involved herself in suitable religious and memorial activities. Only one of her and Stephen's children, Emmerich, lived till adulthood, yet he died in an accident during Stephen's reign, wrecking any hopes for a peaceful throne succession. And after Stephen's death in 1038, Gisela stayed in Hungary for a few years, probably as an exile or a hostage. She did not have an opportunity to exercise her power as an influential widow, like some other women that have been discussed during this conference. And around 1043 or 1046, she fled to Bavaria, where she became an abbess at Niedenburg in Passau and was buried in the same abbey. And we can see on the right picture, this is presumably the original tombstone slab of Abbess Gisela. When looking at the afterlife of Gisela of Hungary, namely the retrospective understanding of her cultural and political role in various medieval commemorative traditions, several drastically different images emerge. Gisela was officially beatified in 1975, and there is no definite evidence that she was the subject of a full-fledged medieval cult with a hagiographic tradition. But we can remark that she was surrounded by an aura of sanctity from early on, because 3 of her close male relatives, brother, spouse, and son, were officially canonized in the 11th and 12th centuries, followed by her sister-in-law, Empress Kunigund. Late medieval Bavarian historiographers, for example, rarely fail to mention that Gisela was a distant relative of the famous Saint Elizabeth, thus forging Gisela's connection to this saint. And her commemoration in Niedenburg, nunnery in Passau, where she spent her last decade as an abbess, seems to have gained cultic characteristic around the 15th century, and that possibly also incited the creation of the new high tombstone and the second slab we can see on the slide. And also in the hagiographic tradition of her spouse, King Stephen, canonized in 1083, Gisela appears as an exemplary pious wife who supports Stephen in his magnanimous donations to the church by contributing crosses, liturgical vessels, and garments. And only once did Gisela appear with a nimbus hinting at her saintly status, namely in the famous Nuremberg Chronicle. In the genealogical tree of her brother, Saint Henry, Gisela is portrayed as a saint, here with a nimbus, together with other saintly members of the same dynasty branch, who all together form sort of a holy stock of the empire. However, another quite different image of Gisela came into being. It's that of, quote, scapegoat for poor government or bad times, to use the definition given by Janusz Bach. According to this tradition, probably originating in the 13th century Hungarian accounts, though timing is still debated, Gisela was an evil intrigant and the one to blame for the political crisis following Stephen's death, because she allegedly stood behind the imprisoning and blooding of Vasul, King Stephen's cousin, and instigating Peter Orseolo on the Hungarian throne. The appearance of this historiographic function can be explained by a later need to whitewash the now holy Stephen's participation in the intrigue, his spouse being a convenient scapegoat, also due to the high medieval anti-German sentiments in the Hungarian kingdom. At the same time, starting from the mid-11th century, multiple chronicles from the German-speaking regions began emphasizing that it was no one but Gisela who sanctified her husband, and sometimes the whole kingdom of Hungary. The first author to mention that Gisela, quote, was the first fosterer of Christianity among people of Pannonia was Wipo in the Deeds of Emperor Conrad II. Wipo introduces the idea of Gisela's agency in the conversion of Hungary when telling about Bruno of Augsburg, Gisela's other brother, and so far Emperor Henry does not exercise any influence in this portrayal. And in a way, the chronicle reflected upon the actual German role in the conversion, which could still be present in the memory of his generation, wrapping it up in the well-known topos of the sanctifying wife that he attached to Gisela, whom actually he doesn't even call by name. Following Pippo, this narrative of Gisela being a proponent of Christian faith in Hungary was taken up by other chronicles, and some of the names are on the slide, but the list is not exhaustive. These authors, although following the same notion that Gisela incited Stephen and subsequently his people to conversion, told the story in different accents, the most common portraying Stephen's baptism as a prerequisite for his marriage. Hermann of Eichenau even makes a wordplay upon Gisela's name. So the name Gisela is according to Geisel, which means a hostage, thus making Gisela a hostage for the faith as she was given to the still pagan Stephen. And for some of these authors, the events at the turn of the millennium were the recent past. For others, the narratives of Christianization became a detached memory torn from its immediate context. Nevertheless, these authors are quite anonymous in crediting Gisela in part fictitious role in the king's conversion and the subsequent conversion of the Hungarians. This role is by no means novel. This function was typically ascribed to women of royal descent, and in Gisela's context, it was especially useful in supporting missionary ambitions of the empire. This tendency culminated with the canonization of Henry II in 1146. And that is when Gisela of Hungary was fully credited with the title of the sanctifying wife in order for the soon-to-be canonized emperor to achieve the status of the apostle and the confessor of the peoples. St. Henry's Vita, written in Bamberg around the time of his canonization, and his canonization followed in 1146, includes the Christianization of Hungary on the list of the holy ruler's achievements. The anonymous author offers a geographically motivated reading of the initial motive, advertising Henry's apostolic role in the whole setup. Moreover, it's implied that the Hungarian kingdom, upon becoming Christian, got subjugated to the empire. When picturing this event, St. Henry's anonymous hagiographer relied on Frutolf of Michelsberg Chronicle that adopted it to fit the profile of the saintly king. In Frutolf's, as well as other chronicles, Henry's reign, if mentioned, is more of a context, while in the Vita, it's the saintly emperor who, quote, drew them to the conversion to the Catholic faith, so that it would be easier to achieve. He wed his sister Gisela to King Stephen, end quote. Gisela's alleged missionary activity became one of the cornerstones of St. Henry's canonization. Henry's image had to be shaped to fit a confessor king type and possibly to reflect upon the agenda of the Second Crusade. And the strategy worked. Eugene III proclaimed in St. Henry's canonization bull that the emperor was canonized for the conversion of King Stephen and the whole Hungary, which he achieved with the help of God. The role of Gisela in this narrative construction is auxiliary par excellence. She's an agent in the hands of her saintly brother Henry, conveying his Christian mission. Gisela's representation in this hagiographic tradition is especially significant since her role is framed through a phrase from Corinthians, quote, "For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband," which is directly cited in the discussed episode in Henry's Vita in order to explain his decision. And this conversion story also features in St. Henry's liturgical office, with the line from the Corinthians being cited as one of the verses. And this phrase has been the main framework for explaining the sanctifying function of other, often holy women, and it proves our point that Gisela was shaped in resemblance with the persuasive wife model. And this model, rooted in the biblical tradition, as well as in historical precedents and hagiographic lore, acknowledged female agency in the process of conversion. This line from the Corinthians was used to describe the converting function of other women, and the most famous of which is Clotilde, of which we've heard yesterday. And starting from Gregory of Tours, her conversion activities were framed through this biblical paradigm. And of course, the central persuasive women have already been mentioned: Olga, legendary Queen Adelheid, Opava, and also Saint Ludmila, the raison d'etre of the current conference. And other women, also in different parts of Europe, were credited with similar proselytizing role. For example, Anglo-Saxon Christian queens contributed towards the conversion of their husbands, and their retinue, at least bead, depicts these queens as fulfilling the scriptural precepts of the Corinthians, though in less overt manner if compared to Claudel or Gisela. And obviously, sanctifying women are symptomatic for the epoch of conversion and missionary activities, conducted also through the soft power of marriage and dynastic alliances. And there are also some examples of such women from the later Middle Ages. And for example, Jadwiga of Anjou, who was wed to Jogaila, then the Duke of Lithuania, who in 1387 was baptized in order to be suitable for marrying the Polish princess, and in turn converted Lithuania to Christianity. And starting off from these historical circumstances, Jadwiga was presented in the subsequent sources as the sanctifying wife. Another example of women invested with agency in conversion activities are the Christian wives of Mongol Huns in the late 13th century, where interestingly in papal letters, mostly of Nicholas IV, addressed to Huns Christian wives, one can recognize the same sentiment, to quote James Ryan, of pastoral exhortations for assistance in the task of spreading the faith that reiterate the traditional role of pious queens in the evangelization, end quote. The story of Gisela's impact on the Christianization presented here is just one of the legendary recollections of conversion history of Hungary, and clearly not the most prominent one. And other authors and historiographic traditions have accentuated the decisive role apart from that of St. Stephen, for example, of Adalbert of Prague, or Emperor Otto III, or Bishop's Pilgrim in Pune. We've also seen that the model of a sanctifying wife is not the only possible reputation or historiographic function that Gisela of Hungary has been given, as she could have been portrayed as a rather evil lady. Nevertheless, the narrative of Gisela as an agent of Christianization was more widespread than what I've had a chance to present here. And for example, she, in her role as a converter of Hungary, also appears in one of the genealogical projects of the Habsburg Emperor Maximilian I. And during his rule, the emperor is well known for sponsoring a plenitude of visual and textual projects through which he realized his own desires of establishing kingship with saints of royal descent and bygone dynasties. In other words, he created his customized royal myth of genealogical continuity. It was mostly Jakob Mennel who worked on unearthing non-existent genealogical connections and preparing lists with short biographic entries in vernacular describing these Habsburg saints and claimed to be ancestors, and Gisela of Hungary was one of them, used as a connector between Burgundian, Imperial, and Hungarian rulers. One of the codices of Maximilian's genealogical project, dated to 1518, is devoted to the illustrious and famous women of the House of Habsburg. It includes an entry about Queen Gisela, among other women, including St. Helen, Elizabeth, Hedwig, as well as Maximilian's contemporaries like his mother, Eleanor, or spouse, Mary of Burgundy. Jakob Mennel, although familiar with St. Henry's hagiography, openly praises Gisela for conversion, not only of her husband Stephen, but also of the Hungarian people, which she achieved through the help of Bishop Adalbert. Jakob Mennel then adds further details to Gisela's established representation. Not knowing the details of her widowhood, Mennel assumes that Gisela was buried in Székesfehérvár together with her husband St. Stephen, where many miracles are witnessed at their common grave. And although this project on Habsburg saints enjoyed neither great impact or any reception, as it was never finalized, it is clear that the knowledge of Gisela's partaking in the conversion of Hungary and her alleged quasi-apostolic saintly status was not only known among early 16th century literati, but also relevant for political representational projects that promoted significance of female sanctity and ancestry. And surely this narrative of Gisela converting Stephen and the Hungarian people can be viewed as an anecdote on the fringes of the literary traditions of most German-speaking historiography. At the same time, this narrative reflected the idea of the apostolic mission being promoted by royal seance and was exploited to create a useful past for furthering Henry's canonization. Moreover, it highlighted the decisive role of female agency in the transition to Christianity, a role that was acknowledged by their contemporaries and in subsequent historiographic traditions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your contribution. So now we know that Gisela was a really very influential person, which contributed many for the Christianization of the Central Europe. I'm opening the discussion. Do you have any question here or online, please? Yes. Gabor Glanica, please. We don't hear you.
Thank you very much for this nice presentation. And being a researcher of this age, I think really it's a very high time to examine the role of Gisela in this conversion process. Not that it hadn't been examined, actually. I just wanted to mention here that there is a canonization process ongoing. So there was a beatification of Gisela in the 19th, 20th century, and there were also her remains had been translated. Some relics had been translated now in the 1990s. But actually, I think it's very appropriate that in the context of this conference on Saint Ludmila, Gisela should be also viewed as one of these mediators. And I think that without much documentation, it's very difficult to make further steps, but to see her role in this context is very important. So actually, I don't have a question. I just wanted to congratulate to this.
Thank you, Gabor. And now, Gregor Spatz, please.
Thank you. I have also enjoyed this paper very much, and I fully agree with Gabor that this is a time to look more deeply to Gisela. I like also the idea, the way you presented that in fact this idea that this Gisela wasn't so much important in the Christianization of Hungary, it is very much German idea. Yes, it's very much, as you said, related with Henry II, and it was fully emphasized in the Vita of Henry II. So in fact, this is very much about him, about Gisela's brother, than about Gisela herself. I just wanted to add maybe one thing, because you skip this, because you put all this text before Vita of St. Henry together, and I think we should put some emphasis to the differences between them, because there's also some developed there. Because, for example, Hermann of Reichenau or Fruthof, as you said, they are saying about this general rule in Christianization. They use this idea of fidei obses, but Sigebert of Gamblois, let me show you this fragment of the text. He is quite clear. He is much more clear than just saying generally about the fidei obses. He is saying hoc tempore ad fidem Christi convertitur per Giselam soror imperatoris. So he's not saying that it was idea of Henry II, but he's the first probably to say that it was Gisela herself. Yes, that she was involved in that. That is much more than saying that simply that she was obses fidei. So I think that this distinguish between those texts should also be stressed. And just one comment that was very interesting what you said. I didn't know that about this later tradition of Gisela being a sort of German spy, let's say, yes, involved in some plots and so on. This is quite interesting because in Poland you have exactly the same story. This is sort of a zeitgeist probably in the turn of the 13th century, when the wife of Mieszko II, so from early 11th century, Rycheza, who is described in Gallus Anonymous Chronicle in very neutral way. In the turn of the 13th century, by Vincentius Kadłubek, she's already described as the one involved in plots, the one who is bringing bad Germans to Poland and so on. And this tradition is exactly like with Gisela, present in the later Middle Ages. And I fully agree that this is obviously related with anti-German sentiments in Central Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your comments. I will kind of further explore the evolution of this narratives from the first mention towards the Henry's Vita, and of course pointing out that there are kind of different accents to what the authors were saying, and yes, this kind of idea of foreign wife as a scapegoat for bad government is quite present, and so I was relying on the Janusz Bach's research in that, and I think he also draws a lot of other parallels that might be interesting to look at. Thank you.
Thank you. And the next is Martin Homza.
So I would congratulate as well, and I'm very happy that somebody is going to finally work with Gisela issue, and it is extremely exciting, I would say. And I have several comments which might help you possibly. So first of all, what about put the policy of marriage of some representative of Western dynasty, namely Bavarian or East Frankish dynasty of Carolingian, with some important male representative of domestic dynasties here in Central Europe. For instance, I would start with Príbina and his possible Bavarian princess, and then coincidentally, Aventinus speaks about Gisela, the sister of Arnulf, who married Svetopluk, the first of Moravia. And so coincidentally, Gisela is named as well, this woman. And then, of course, my research showed that there is really important to also include into research, into the field of the research, some pictorial materials. And as I know, there is also cross of Gisela somewhere. Excuse me, please, I'm not prepared for this discussion properly, but somewhere in Germany. And then
I think in Passava.
I think in Regensburg, actually.
Or in Regensburg, yes, possibly.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
And there is also this Esztergom reliquary, which it is somehow connected with Gisela as well. And possibly we can continue, but let's go back to this Pannonian policy of East Frankish and German rulers. So we can continue with the daughter of Henry III, which was married for the son of Andrew, that is Salomon, and etc. So yes, Bavarians, or not Bavarians, Habsburgs were right when started to find a way how to put in these ancient habits some kind of new wind. Okay, so this is my first comments, but really I'm very glad to hear that somebody is going finally to work with Gisela, and especially in our Slovak-Hungarian milieu, because, you know, for everything bad, we're responsible in our history, just women, you know.
Thank you very much for your comments, and it's very a good point that kind of to ground it also in the discussion of the actually merit policies. But for visual representations, unfortunately, we don't have that much. It's this cross, it's the representation of the Hungarian coronation mantle, and I think from the contemporary, that's it. But I'll be happy to deal more with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Of course, the women are important. We know it. That's why we have this conference about Saint Ludmila. Und nun wartet auf das Wort der Doktorvater, Herr Ziemann, bitte.
Thank you very much, Iliana, for this fascinating lecture. I just have a short question, because Martin Homza mentioned in his book also the previous generation, so Geza and Adelaide. And I was wondering whether did you find any connections? So because the Polish-Hungarian Polish Chronicle, which mentions her as somehow also it's 13th century. Is there any connection? Is it a reaction to these tendencies to put Gisela or Henry in the forefront? So then, just to go back one generation, did you find any connection, or is this to be posited in a different context?
Yeah, thanks for your question. I haven't found anything that would be, and actually like the narratives of Gisela being attributed to this role, whether kind of reflecting on the actual German involvement or then within the very, let's say, geographical prism of this sanctifying wife model is kind of, I think, earlier than the Hungarian Polish Chronicle, if I'm not mistaken. But I think it's also something I could write down to look into. But as far as I know, I could not figure anything.
Now is the turn of Dana Stehlíková, and next then is Martin Homza again. Prosím, paní Stehlíková. Neslyšíme se asi. So, please, Martin, it's your floor.
Thank you, Professor Zimmermann, for your question. Yes, and I would find some connections between Hungarian Polish Chronicle and this image of Saintly Adelaida. And simply to answer it, this surrounding of Koloman, who was possibly one of the men behind the written version of the chronicle. There were this blessed Salome and the sister of Koloman, or not sister, the Koloman, the nephew of Koloman was future Saint Kunigunda, the firstborn daughter of Belo the Fourth, and sister of Koloman was Saint Elizabeth. So I suppose all these saintly female links were somehow in knowledge of on the courts of Arpadians in the 13th century. So this could be also the case of Gisela. So this is my point. Thank you, Professor Zimmermann.
Thank you, Professor Homza.
Do you have any other question, contribution? Dana Stehlíková is always...
Excuse me, can you hear me now?
Yes, now it's
so
perfect.
Hello, thank you for your speech. And I would like to ask if you searched for iconography, if you search for painting and sculpture. Because I'm a historian of art and I searched for the legends. I must say it's a question how it was in the 15th, 16th century.
Mm-hmm. So thing is for your question, so as Gisela did not have kind of full-fledged cult, she was never canonized during the Middle Ages, and as Gabor said, actually the procedure is still going on. There is not that much of visual, a lot of visual representations of her in kind of established iconographic traditions. The only thing we can talk about is actually her tombstone from Niedenburg from the 1420s. It's not her representation, but still it gives a perception of what kind of relations the local nuns and devotees might have with this kind of proto-saint and with her commemoration. For example, there is in Niedenburg Abbey also in the representation of Saint Hedwig, and some scholars kind of believe that actually it might function for local devotees as the representation of Gisela, but it's more of a kind of broad assumption. But as for kind of as contemporary representation, I've named them, and for medieval representation of her sanctity, apart from the Nuremberg Chronicle that I've shown, there is nothing that I could point at. And of course, the occasional miniatures and the Hungarian chronicles that I've also had on my slide, where Gisela is represented as a kind of pious supporter of saintly King Stephen.
So we didn't search for it in Hungary, because it's especially Hungarian art where it becomes in. But it's interesting that in comparison with Saint Stephen and Saint Emmerich, it's much weaker. Yeah, we have very interesting authors, for example, from Slovakia, from Poprad. It's Mateusz, formerly a village, now a part of that town, where is a beautiful altar with the life of Saint Stephen, Gisela, and Emmerich. But Gisela is not saint. The only saint is there, Emmerich. She's depicted her by funerary. And this, I think so, is the only representation till 15th century. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So please, it could be for you an interesting search. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I also kind of had the perception that in the Hungarian kind of memory of these events, the idea of Gisela, of this kind of evil Gisela, who was then intrigued behind the blighting of Azul and so on, was quite strong and propagated by local chronicles. And kind of this a different commemorative scenario developed for her in Hungary as compared to the to kind of Bavarian lands and the Passau, where she was actually buried. But that's a very nice call. Thank you. I will.
Yes, but the chronicles as well as legends are since 12th century illustrated, so you can collect those and other find some more sources.
Thank you.
Many thanks for the rich contributions, rich discussion. So, and many thanks to Iliana Kandzha for her perfect paper.